So my name is Edward Barton, and this is Johanna Westermann. We are both Master Urban Design students at TU Berlin. And as part of our research project on the transformation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region until the year 2040, we would like to welcome Professor Ash Amin to our interview series. Ash Amin is a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge, and he's interested in the geographies of modern living, as well as political and economic transformation processes and their effects on situated life. He's also very well known for his research on cities as being relationally constituted, and obviously his critical view on systemically produced economic and social inequalities. His most recent works include the European Union and Disunion, Releasing the Commons, and obviously Seeing Like a City, that he co-authored with Nigel Thrift, and which we will talk about later today.
Our research project, BB 2040, is based on the assumption that infrastructures as socio-technical or ecological systems constitute the foundation of the urban, and therefore play a key role in future development processes. We are therefore very grateful to have Professor Ash Amin with us today as an expert, and we would like to talk about the city seen from an infrastructural perspective today. So thank you.
Thank you both for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And of course, our COVID times are making proximity such a difficult thing.
In one of your last books, Seeing Like a City, you promote a new perspective of how we may understand the city. And our first question would be, how does the city look like seen from a city's perspective? And how does that maybe differ to the concept of seeing like a state?
In our book, Nigel Thrift and I are trying to argue the need to see the world through the eyes of the city. Given the centrality today of city systems, of urban processes, urban developments in world affairs, right? Whether it comes to question of politics or economics or culture or communications or the Anthropocene or even pandemics, you know, cities are at the heart of the world system. So what we wanted to do in this book is to work with the assumption that the ontological importance of cities is profound. And we wanted to understand how city life, therefore, is made and governed, ground up, through its own enduring socio-technical systems and processes. We were trying to argue against a behavioral or humanist or human-centered perspective by wanting to recognize that actually, you know, cities are machines, they're kind of assemblages of networks and infrastructures. Hence the title of the book, and also our desire to attempt to capture, to theorize the recursive dynamics and practices, horizontal, bottom-up, within cities, in contrast to the more standard, top-down, panoptical, and abstract interpretations of city life. And these latter abstractions you could summarize as seeing like a state. Mm-hmm. So in the book, we take a very broad definition, trying to cover the full spectrum of socio-technical systems that arrange urban life, from the architecture and signals put out by the built environment to the staples of survival, such as the provision of food and electricity, water, sanitation systems. But you know, also the institutions, both formal and informal, of welfare, such as education, housing, and health. And on top of all of this, you could also add all the metabolisms, metabolic infrastructures that shape the urban environment, and of course our carbon footprint. For us, these socio-technical systems are the pulse and the machinery of the city. How so? By making provisions, of course, always in uneven ways, by governing the full complexity of urban life, by shaping the urban environment and habitat, by constituting the symbolic landscape as an indicator of progress and modernity, by becoming, if you like, the markers of public affect and disposition. Okay, urban socio-technical systems also condition our kind of feelings and beliefs. And finally, also by acting as, if you like, political technologies, as sources of hidden power beyond government, elites, and those kind of human sources of world and urban power. So all these, through these different definitions and resonances, if you like, of socio-technical systems, you could say that they're all determining and they're all implicated in some way in the making and in the governance of urban life.
Would you say that infrastructures are everything that makes up these socio-technical systems?
I think by infrastructures we mean, I suppose, in that kind of Latourian sense, of all those socio-technical arrangements and networks that are involved in the provisioning, governance, and kind of symbolic articulation of urban life. These socio-technical systems are there in the background. Mm-hmm. They're part of the urban subconscious. Mm-hmm. They are very powerful technologies, but they're not all-encompassing and all-determining.
Well, so actually, we mentioned this this topic of access and actually like the political implications of infrastructure or the perspective of seeing like a city. But before we go to this in more detail, we would like to draw the attention to this to this question: how do we have to maybe draw a difference between cities in the global north and the global south? I have mentioned in previous interviews that the European city had more or less reached the end of its development. So what does that mean for the way you see infrastructures, and how do we have to look at infrastructures differently for cities in the global south and the global north?
So let me just say straight off, I don't think the European city has reached as you put it, the end of its development. Far from it. So infrastructure is everywhere in European cities, and it dominates everything in it. Life works through socio-technical systems in European cities and is dependent on them. And indeed, these systems are continuing to grow by incorporating more and more software-led intelligence and agency, by becoming, let's call them lively or interactive technologies. They have now enormous symbolic, political, and material power. So if this is the case, then I think the politics of the Western city, as I said a few minutes ago, has to work through this hidden power. You know, by making it visible, by tweaking it for particular goals, by reaching publics through it, by managing the environment in smart ways. And then conversely, you know, consider also the huge implications of infrastructural breakdowns in Western cities when this happens, when all the dependencies and relationships that are constructed around networks stop working. And, you know, pandemics and other crises reveal this all too clearly in, you know, cities of the global north, because the whole of urban life is almost instantaneously disabled. It's kind of switched off. Compare this with the situation in the global south. There, you could say that the infrastructures are more incomplete, more informal, more socially selective, and acutely contested. And this situation, I think, makes the problem of infrastructures, let's say the questions of water supply or electricity supply or access to healthcare, much more visible and at the very heart of political struggle. You know, there are battles over the infrastructure by different interest groups. Usually the battles end up favoring the elites and the middle classes, but nonetheless they remain at the heart of populist campaigns. Whereas I think in the global north, though infrastructure has the same material, political, and social power, that power remains unacknowledged. It remains kind of hidden, okay? It's not at the center of political struggle. I think another difference between North and South is how people, especially the poor, are implicated, involved in the functioning of infrastructures. In the global South, because the infrastructures are often incomplete or don't work or have not quite reached, don't have universal reach, people, as Malik Simon argues, people also act as infrastructure. You know, they contribute to building vernacular infrastructures, housing, neighborhoods, roads, you know, pirating electricity or water, whatever. People become involved in community provisioning, in neighborhood construction. Absolutely, they're involved in social repair. You know, they become an extension of infrastructure, or infrastructure is an extension of human subjectivity and community.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this also relates to the question of infrastructures as contributing to socio-economic inequalities. And you made a reference at some point in your book to the right to the city. It sort of reminded us of the hierarchy of needs from Maslow. And we were wondering if that's sort of where you're also aiming that like these basic infrastructures have to be established. What is actually then these basic infrastructures, and what is the next level to reach the right to the city?
So my understanding of Maslow is that his hierarchy of needs essentially proposes that 5 categories of human need guide individual prospect and individual behavior. And these, in ascending order, are physiological needs, safety needs, the needs of belonging and care, esteem needs, and then finally, right at the very top, self-actualization needs. So trying to link up Maslow to our work, I think it would be logical to suggest that the baseline infrastructures of water, of air, of energy, of food, welfare, sanitation, actually also information and mobility, in our schema are especially significant for Maslow's first 2 levels of meeting A, physiological needs, and then B, safety needs. And here we know that within and between North and South, there are huge exclusions of the poor, of vulnerable and migrant populations. And their pathway to these, and actually also to the upper levels of Maslow's hierarchy, of leading a fulsome and meaningful life, that pathway is blocked, okay, very often, because they don't have access to the first 2, the infrastructures necessary for the first 2 needs. And so what happens here is that they need to find access elsewhere through the kind of hit and miss possibilities of solidarities and supports from family, neighborhood, and community, not through socio-technical systems. But then I think here there's a twist, okay? On the other hand, if we accept our premise in the book that urban socio-technical systems in their entirety and their full variety, and of course interdependencies as well, make up that urban assemblage that intervenes in all areas of subjectivity and the life world. Remember, I outlined a series of systems, networks, and technologies. You could then argue that all levels of need, right, from number 1 to number 5, are refracted, are filtered through the technosphere, through socio-technical systems, which, at least in some parts of the world, are the life force and very lively in this respect. New developments like artificial intelligence and the incorporation of software technologies into urban systems, they enter more and more into the governance of belonging, of esteem, and also self-actualization. How so? By conditioning access to education, to connectivity, to public institutions, to symbolic capital, to elite decision networks, elite networks, to the spaces of leisure and pleasure in the city. So, if this is true, then you could argue that those social groups with an easy passage through the levels of fulfillment often are those who have the easiest and most intensive access to urban socio-technical systems, okay, to the urban commons. And this is where this connection with Maslow really comes in, okay? That what I'm trying to argue is that if you have a fuller understanding of socio-technical systems, A, which B are becoming smarter and smarter by the day because of the availability of computational technologies, then it then probably follows that often the privileged position of middle classes and elites within cities is such not because of their own pathways through the hierarchy, but because of their full use of and access to the urban socio-technical systems. And conversely, that means that the inability of people without full access to socio-technical systems is one in our modern age, perhaps less so in the South, where these infrastructures are less well developed, that their access along every single step of the hierarchy is dependent upon their relationship to the socio-technical systems. You could then say that the right to the city as an infrastructural right of the fullest kind provides the means to the many to progress up to the peaks of the hierarchy, which is of course not to say that this is a sufficient condition. I'm not arguing against individual capacities and capabilities or communal resources, but I'm saying that it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition.
And you've talked a lot about this access to these systems now. And I mean, in Berlin, and I guess also in a lot of places in the UK, the actual access to basic infrastructure is given, but they all and most of them still cost money in a way.
Mm.
So that already divides again.
I think it is true that these basic infrastructures, which are supposed to be universally available, are actually socially very selective. There can be very little doubt about this. It's pretty well known that the well-off tend to benefit the most from universal urban provisions because they have other circuits of supply and support to draw on, but also because the basic provisions that are supposed to be for everybody are unevenly distributed. So, often those who are less well off and those who are living in areas in which the infrastructural quality is not that great often encounter poor health and educational resources. They often get only conditional insurance and access to other social protections. They will often find themselves in slower, more crowded, more expensive transport and communications networks. They often have much greater hoops to go through in order to get higher level services.
Yeah, actually, I imagine that especially education and in Bourdieu terms, like the habitus you're inheriting or practicing in your everyday life ties very importantly into these socio-technical infrastructures and really determines your position in society. I mean, looking at internet as something like a technical infrastructure, but depending on your education, you can do totally different things with that infrastructure, right? And this really defines your power and your position in society.
Absolutely. I mean, I've done a lot of work on informal settlements and slums around the world. It's so starkly evident that in those cities, whether it's Delhi or Shanghai or Belo Horizonte in Brazil or Cape Town, that in the informal settlements, you have infrastructural deficits and infrastructural lack and infrastructural breakdown. So all the labor that generally we would see of an infrastructural nature, water, electricity, provisioning, getting access to food and healthcare and education, that burden is borne by the individuals and their families. Whereas a few kilometers into the city center, where the infrastructures are in place, from basic through to more higher level infrastructures, those people who have access to them, let's call them the middle classes, take them for granted, right? Their capacity to develop and their social capital is premised almost entirely on the availabilities made through the hidden socio-technical systems. So it's kind of hardly surprising that the social blockages that you find in so many slums and informal settlements of the world are so because people don't have access to the basic means of life, which others take for granted.
How do you see the importance of access to public space, actually? Public space as also like a kind of infrastructural resource as a social space, as a political space that might contribute to a more democratic society.
We tend to assume that access to public culture, public life, and the right to participate is central to any democratic society. So here we assume that by having access to public culture, in a Habermasian or other sense, is the way in which again, the many and not just the few are given voice and agency and the right to deliberate and decide. I think of public space, urban public space, in much the same way. I think, free and universal access to well-maintained and nourishing public spaces, you could count that as a kind of condition of freedom. So access to parks, to festivals, to public squares, to public resources. I think all of these can be understood as central to having a right to the city. They can be understood as an indicator of social equivalence between people, as a passageway into experiencing the unknown or the strange or the common as familiar, as your own. And above all, it can be seen as a shared resource, public space, that supports the private, and often it enhances it. So, for example, in my work on migrants, rural migrants in Shanghai, I found that the poor and the socially most vulnerable benefit enormously from having access to decent public spaces. So my Shanghai project is on the mental health of migrants. And there were 2 case study areas, and one was in central Shanghai, focusing on younger people with a very brilliant anthropologist called Lisa Richaud. And what we found there was that young people confront the shock of the modern urban and all the stresses and strains that produces, sometimes with great difficulty, sometimes through different forms of endurance. And we found that capacity to endure, to manage stress, came from having access to libraries, where they can browse these self-help books. In some public libraries, we found, beautiful rosewood furniture, amazing libraries. These stressed out individuals, often unemployed, are allowed to hang out there for long periods, to use the computing, to kind of sleep, take it easy. And the same kind of process are at work in the cafes, in the streets, and in the parks. So, and I found this in, the informal settlement that I was also looking at in Delhi, in South Delhi recently, in January, where within the neighborhood, all sorts of places of gathering have arisen, whether there are shrines or temples or street corners or unused open spaces where kids play or people hang out to get drunk or whatever, What's happening here is that access to public space, mingling in public space, manages to help these individuals ease their burden, to ease their stress. It makes them feel like co-citizens with other urban residents. It distracts them from their anxieties. Kind of makes them feel part of a wider whole. So here, public spaces become sites of social belonging. As long as, of course, there are no discriminations going on. And, I'm aware that I might be painting a rather rosy picture here, because it's also true that, the history of urban surveillance and urban public space management is also the history of placing many barriers in the way of those urban subjects who are considered to be non-citizens, who are considered to be a threat, who are considered to be, in the context of today's pandemic, as carriers of disease. right? Beyond the question of, do I think urban public space is important? There's also the question of what kind of urban public space and available to whom, and here again, there are certain principles of free access and, if you like, human recognition, which are quite important, I think.
And actually, yeah, like how does this refer to the, well, European or let's say global North public space? As in previous interviews, you also sometimes mentioned the death of public life in European cities. How do you see it in this context?
There is a tendency towards the evacuation or the over-policing of public space in the cities of the North. Mm-hmm. Probably less so in European cities, but it's a trend. And of course, in those cities, you don't have many vernacular public spaces in the way that you have, in informal settlements and poor neighborhoods in cities of the South. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, and of course, there's another dimension here, which is the commodification of urban public space that you see in the North, with every park that's closed down or that's left to decay, you get a new shopping mall coming up and everybody is being urged to, go into a particular kind of a public space, where I think the resonances that I mentioned earlier on, all these contributions, if you like, to democratic citizenship and human recognition are kind of diminished. In the kind of the world of shopping malls, we go from being citizens to consumers. But there are limits here as well, and I think it's also true that especially in the last few decades, I think partly because of a whole series of attempts by municipalities and cities to bring back urban public space, whether it's at the waterfront or big squares or parks or libraries, there is that counter move as well, I think, of people both occupying and desiring urban public space. So I think there's a kind of an ebb and flow to the significance of urban public space within cities. And I think there's a really interesting development going on right now in the pandemic, where, of course, we're all, or most of us, are self-distancing. And, the number of cars on the roads has gone right down, or at least it did for a while. And you saw how, again, with social distancing rules in place, how the cities have become much more public arenas of people spilling over onto the road, and they're walking, of people being out and taking exercise, right? The indoors are for isolation, the outdoors are for breathability and not so much social interaction. So there's a kind of tacit reappraisal, appreciation of, let's call them the urban commons, the great urban outdoors, the remaking as public and as common of dangerous spaces like fast roads or of, overused or overshopped public spaces. I think this is quite a promising moment in many ways.
Do you think one could say that in the global south, like for example, in the informal settlements you mentioned in the south of Delhi, there is less of a tendency to dictate what is allowed to happen in a public space?
It's difficult to avoid dictation because that kind of depends on where formal and informal power resides. And, in the overgoverned city, which tend to be mainly in the north, there, in some ways, so much has to filter through socio-technical systems, but also those institutions and individuals who run the socio-technical systems, including urban public space, you know. But I think in the global south, what you've got is, you've got such an amazing amount of ontological variety and heterogeneity in cities that the potentialities of urban public space vary enormously. You've got kind of grotesquely fast forms of commodification going on, no doubt about that. You've got the capture of large parts of the city for the uses of those people with most disposable income and social power, no question. But you've also got, you know, vast sections of the city that are under the radar of planning, that are, you know, the so-called unrecognized or informal settlements. And there, what I think you find, and this is a huge generalization, but I'll make it, you find that the making of public space is by and large vernacular. It's the product of cohabitation and living together, and spaces being shared between people, animals, nature, materials. And of course, there's a huge amount of spillover of life, private life, into these public spaces because the housing is absent or cramped or without provisions, you know, without socio-technicality. You know, that combination of vernacular making, the presence of multiple agents and subjects in a shared space, of the relative absence of formal power or of planning interventions, I think produces a certain, you know, what Richard Sennett would call an open city dynamic, you know, where through the commingling of so many different forms of actancy and the co-presence of so many people and things, a kind of bottom-up culture of public space emerges and develops, which is a combination of a tacit assumption that this is our space, this is a shared space, but at the same time, because it's a kind of spillover of the private, you also get a lot of arguments and animosities and kind of jostling going on, right, between competing groups. It's and that sometimes that competition between different subjects in the same public space can turn quite violent. The atmosphere of a public space doesn't only arise from the mingling of bodies within it, but is heavily influenced by public talk, by biopolitical selection, and naming and shaming of particular individuals. And it's in those moments in which there's a greater intensity in public culture of identifying particular urban citizens as non-citizens or undesirable citizens, that those kind of resonances can filter all the way through into neighborhoods and public spaces within the neighborhoods, where yesterday's friends become tomorrow's enemies.
I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the Erscheinungsraum from Hannah Arendt. She wrote on public space, and two very important qualities of, well, what you could say a true political space in her perspective is the permanence of basically political discourse happening, and the difference of opinions appearing more or less in parallel or seeing each other somehow. And so I'm a little bit occupied with this idea, like how does the contemporary protest culture that we have on the street, which is basically just based on uttering one opinion, versus the idea of deliberation, where basically we have a space of negotiation, or as you also mentioned it, right? You have the Hindus cohabiting with the Muslims, and it's a seeing of the other in the public space. Yeah, how would you define political space in that context, or how do we actually might need a different type of infrastructure than what we have today, or like how we understand public space as a political space?
I mean, I'm entirely in agreement with Arend's perspective. I would take as given that the public sphere and public spaces in which that are simply multicultural, without interaction, without deliberation, without peaceful fighting or disagreement, are not full-blown democracies. From my perspective, is required in, as we face these incredibly difficult and uncertain times, which are actually times of more shouting and non-negotiation than their opposite, is somehow creating a kind of politics of where the cultures of disagreement proliferate, partly through making representative democracy much more accountable, partly through the absolute strengthening of all forms of active and participatory democracy, partly through the revitalization of a public sphere that, a media culture, for instance, that has become so homogeneous and so colonized by particular interests and so instantaneous and of the moment, where public culture needs to become much more deliberative, much more argumentative, much more locked up in slow time, much more the product of active voice and debate and disagreement. And in the brew, I would throw in also the remaking of urban public space in certain ways, where there is voice and not exit, and there is disagreement and not just agreement, where there is a kind of vernacular of almost, if you could, let's call it self-policing in the way Jane Jacobs wrote about, rather than policing through surveillance systems.
So at the center of the project BB 2040 is sort of the speculations of the future of infrastructures. And we're asking how infrastructures need to change or reconfigure, especially in light of climate change, migration movements, whatever might come. So the question would be, what do you think are the most important infrastructural transformations that will happen in the coming years? And maybe what infrastructures do you see failing at the moment?
Allow me to answer this thing in general terms, but also in today's context. The COVID-19 pandemic, I think, begs a fundamental question. Should city systems be oriented towards growth at any cost, or towards human, non-human, and environmental health and well-being? The pandemic has put everyone at risk in especially dense city environments, but above all, those who are vulnerable, those who are on the front line, the essential workers, those who have to work because they're on poor income, and also those who are blamed for the disease, often migrants and immigrants. So I think, this is a moment to imagine a radically new urban future where city infrastructures are imagined as being actively enrolled in the delivery of health and well-being, right? Imagine what such a city should be doing. And that involves, I think, a radical rethinking of urban socio-technical systems and priorities, which I think range from rewilding, maximizing green and collective spaces, ensuring decent housing, lively housing, but not crowded houses and neighborhoods, maintaining walkable streets and very generous, capacious public transport, providing active health monitoring, but also a raft of investments at municipal and especially at national level, especially in countries like mine, to ensure that those who are most in need are not stuck in the gig economy or in badly paid jobs, in facing uncertain futures, or without the basic necessities on which you build capabilities and capacities, Maslow. And then there are all those interventions that should in the future ensure the greening of the city, because we found that the pandemic problem at city level is exacerbated by not just the growth agenda, but also by cities being slave to markets. So what is, further greening of the city means more set-aside schemes, rewilding, urban agriculture, green buildings, the circular economy, the green economy. And the reason for answering your question in this way, if you allow me, is that the window for this kind of new thinking, a radical reappraisal of what cities are for and how best you deliver a new urban agenda. The window for this kind of thinking, radical, imaginative, long-term, actually is really very narrow, because there is already the rush to return to how things were before, including in our cities, right? There's this mantra, it's in the UK, but elsewhere in Europe as well, of coming out of the pandemic through build and more build. And here, I'm reminded by how quickly the critique that developed of banks at the beginning of the 2008 crisis, how quickly it evaporated and how quickly public culture and policy thinking settled around austerity, And I think we face a similar future now, unless cities and national governments finally, take the big step to start thinking of cities as the staples of long-term sustainability and the well-being of all the populations that live in cities. So this is a very important moment in which, if you like, the color and the orientation, the purpose of socio-technical systems needs to be really thought through again, right from the basics.
The Tempelhof Airfield is an inner-city airport that stopped operating in 2008. It was slowly illegally appropriated by the public as a leisure space. Today, used by a diversity of social groups, it is the largest public green area in Berlin. As the site has been entirely repurposed, it might not represent a reconfiguration of infrastructure per se, yet we do believe this transformation may be seen as an interesting example for for thinking about infrastructure in new ways?
I closed my last comment by saying that there needs to be this kind of radical rethinking of what cities are for, and including their urban public spaces. And to me, the temple of development is exactly the sort of experiment I have in mind. But of course, so far I've implied that the thrust towards city well-being should come from the central authorities. And of course, it's also the case that so often, too frequently, they side with the interests of capital. So grassroots and vernacular initiatives like Tempelhof are really, really important, I think. They're crucial, especially if they involve democratic deliberation and planning, and now we can say also disagreement. The communal vernacular is a very rich source of imaginative urban innovations, often with a kind of foresight that official planners of cities don't have. Because these vernaculars see the city right from the start as serving a different purpose and for different subjects, including non-humans. And here we really do need to desperately break free from the rollout of formulaic urban regeneration programs that we're seeing all over the world. So to me, the anarchist and autonomist legacy of Berlin is a legacy that should be cherished and nurtured. It makes Berlin different. It makes Berlin experimental. It makes Berlin humanly quite desirable. It's an exciting place to be in. So, wouldn't it be wonderful if, for instance, Berlin's history of squatting practices was seen as homemaking practices to learn from? Wouldn't it be amazing to see disused sites and natures just left to develop their own ecologies in the way that parts of Tempelhof have been? And finally for us to, once and for all, to come to a view that cities are not just for humans. So I think the world is full of examples of vernacular city making, which is what's going on in Tempelhof, I think, and vernacular urban adjustment, slow incremental changes to the urban fabric, which we too quickly, choose to label as illegal or anomalous or counter-historical or against the grain, when actually they're really about the city of commonwealth or city of care, the city of a kind of socio-environmental justice.
Let's come to the last question. In the debate on the EU's efforts to boost the economy after the pandemic, a group of economists has been promoting a plan to build a European high-speed train network. The network might severely cut down air travel and therefore reduce carbon emissions, but this infrastructure would be very costly and might exclude a large number of people. A civil society group is therefore promoting a European-wide night train network that is slower but also cheaper to implement and cheaper in use.
So now the question would be, how do you see maybe in general these kind of quite large newly built infrastructures?
Yeah, this is such an interesting example and it's such an interesting question. So I would say this: when seeing like a state ends up benefiting the many and not just the few, and in quite genuine ways, it should not be rejected.
Mm-hmm.
The history of the best examples of post-war welfarism or of post-colonial societal reconstruction, are two powerful examples in the form of state-led projects to improve mass housing, health, transport, education, communication, and of course, access to the likes of water and energy. In our book, towards the end, we explicitly say that state-led projects, which are about the mass engineering of well-being, are important projects because they can deliver speedily and at a scale that's otherwise hard to contemplate, and with public resources. So it's when these kind of projects become selective and exclusionary that they lose their universalistic and general potential. You know, when I say that these kind of state-led, large state-led projects could be okay and they could be worth defending, it's only the case when they have legitimacy and social and spatial and environmental reach. So they can't just be imposed. Their planning needs to go through multiple social audits and social deliberations. And there has to be a willingness of the authorities to adapt them if there is sufficient public criticism. It goes back to our earlier discussion about having an active, lively, enabling democracy. So this said, there are also no substitute for, if you like, the Tempelhof infrastructural experiments, for incremental adaptive city evolution, which is rolled out through experiments around everyday urban infrastructures, okay, by different communities. And I think we have to find a way of building these up, these incremental adaptive infrastructures, and making them much more robust, publicly recognizing what they do, and also connecting them up with the wider engineering interventions. So what I'm implying is that seeing like a city and seeing like a state shouldn't be in conflict with each other, especially if both of them are harnessed to the same kind of normative goal. And in the present, it has to be a normative goal of making future cities socially and environmentally both livable and sustainable. If there was to be a dialogue between the incremental and vernacular on the one hand, and the, if you like, engineered and imposed on the other hand, then what we might be able to reach is a position in which the more detached and the spectacle type experiments of state intervention could become more domesticated, more, better grounded, and put to the public test. And perhaps with enough interdependence between the statist and the vernacular, then both sides of the coin could be nudged in new and better directions, okay? So in the context of the Europe-wide train, a possible answer could be that a way forward might be by putting in place the Europe-wide train network, but making sure that it works at night and not during the day, but that the trains alternate between fast and expensive trains and slow and cheap ones, with both of them subjected to very rigorous environmental standards. Okay?
Very smart answer, Ash. I like it.
It's a kind of a compromise. A kind of a compromise, but with both at least normatively heading in the same direction.
I feel like that's a very beautiful finish.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you so much, Ash. It was really, really great to talk to you. Very insightful. And yeah, we're really happy that we had you on board for this interview series for our research project.
I'm really glad to do it, and all the best with your project.
Thank you.